Any health-related information on the following show provides general information only. Content presented on any show, by any host, or by any guest should not be substituted for a doctor's advice. Always consult your physician before you begin any new diet, exercise, or training program. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Welcome to Healing Ties on the Whole Care Network. On Healing Ties, we're creating a life to love after caregiving ends by sharing stories and resources and being with awesome people like you. Now that caregiving has ended, let the Healing Ties begin. Here's your host, Chris McClellan, the bow tie guy.
Well, greetings everyone. It is Chris McClellan, the bow tie guy, for another episode of Healing Ties. Thanks for joining me today. Certainly want to send a hello and a shout out to all of our listeners in the UK on ukhealthradio.com. Thank you for your continued support of the show and the Whole Care Network and of course, ukhealthradio.com. So I just want to share just a quick story. As just this past week, I was over in Tampa at AARP's Caregiver Accelerator program and had the opportunity to just be involved in a pitch deck where 7 participants did a 6-minute pitch about each product that they have developed in and around caregiving and their own caregiving experience. And what the experience reminded me about Monday is why we're doing the Whole Care Network in these podcasts, because everybody has a story to share. And I think, as my listeners have heard me say before, it's through short story sharing where diversity meets the road to combat a common cause. And as I listen to all the different pitches, all the different products, all the creativity that people have from their caregiving experience, it just reminded me that how so many of us who in the caregiving sphere who really don't know one another personally, but through our story sharing experiences, we do have an innate ability to understand each other and where we've been in our caregiving journey. And that's going to come up today in our conversation with Catherine Hodder, who is an estate planning attorney and currently out in California, which I think I want to go out in California. We should have just done this live in California today, Catherine, but thanks for joining me this morning.
Well, I'm from Florida, so I love Florida too. So, yeah.
It's kind of, that balance, Florida, California, the water, yeah. it's there.
Yeah, as long as there's water and sunshine, I'm good.
Water and sunshine, it does make a difference. For me coming from Missouri, there's not a lot of sunshine in the wintertime, but that's for another conversation. But goodness, thanks for reaching out and joining me today. And why don't you tell
it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about you and your practice, and then we're going to get into your caregiving story and how you ended up doing what you're doing today.
Yes. Well, currently, I was an estate planning attorney in South Florida with a mobile law practice in estate planning. So I would visit young families or people who are gravely ill and help them with their estate planning. And through my husband's career, I moved to California, and I decided instead of opening another practice to write a book, for people to help them with their estate planning. It's called Estate Planning for the Sandwich Generation, How to Help Your Parents and Protect Your Kids. And I hope to reach more people and make estate planning more accessible to them, especially if they are caring for, young kids, aging parents.
And your story is very similar to folks that we were fortunate to talk to across the country about caregiving. Is they end up having a caregiving experience, and they see a gap and a need, and they act on it. And I think, as I understand your story with your father, that's kind of what's led you to estate planning.
Well, yes. So, my background was actually in banking and corporate finance. In law school, I took a couple of estate planning classes just because I thought it was interesting. It's related to money and contracts. But when my father began a series of mini strokes, and then what we found out would be a 10-year battle with Alzheimer's disease, it was only then that I realized that even though I had legal training and experience, that there's a lot more to estate planning that I didn't realize, and how if things are done properly, it can really help with a caregiving journey. So because my father was a very organized person, and we talked about it, he did have his estate planning done. So when he went into decline, our family could step in and take care of things for him and make things go as smoothly as possible. And really it hit home with me about how much I didn't know, and how much the average person probably doesn't know. So when I started practice in South Florida, I really wanted to focus on estate planning and helping people, get their documents together, because I think a common misconception about estate planning is just it's for when you die.
Right.
But really it's critical to have certain things in place for, in incapacity. It could be a temporary incapacity, but they do happen, or, unexpected illnesses. And really I wanted to show people how estate planning can help in many different ways.
And I think one of the important components here is you don't want to do these important documents while you're in the middle of an emergency.
Well, right. When a family's thrown into chaos because somebody's hospitalized, or, you get a really bad news about an illness, there's so many other things going on that to then say, well, let's try to meet with a banker to change titles on accounts. I mean, it's just kind of, there's too much involved for the actual caregiving. So it's, if you can kind of plan ahead, you can handle what life throws at you. And life will throw something at you much easier.
There's so many different questions I'd want to ask you on estate planning, but I think one of the first things, and I think it might be consistent across the board, is how do you start a conversation like this with your parents or your loved ones?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, because it's not something that people really talk about in everyday conversation. There could be, hesitancy on the part of somebody focusing on the fact that they might die someday or get sick. And so in my book, I talk about estate planning, that it's not something that you just sit down and do. It's an ongoing process. And I compare it to, eating an elephant, where you take one bite at a time. So
that's a great analogy. That is a great analogy.
So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, because people think about estate planning as like, I have to have everything decided, and that's not necessarily true. You just sort of work the process of like, well, what are your wishes? What would you like? And then you work from there. And in, talking to parents, talking to loved ones, actually in my book, I break it down into sections of like, the financial talk. So to get information about, do they have a durable power of attorney, or what bank accounts do they have? Do they have to pay quarterly taxes? That sort of came up when my father was hospitalized. All of a sudden, I'm asking my mother, well, do you guys pay quarterly taxes, and what bills are due? And, he took care of all the finances. She didn't know. And, because he was organized, I had to sort of step in and become a forensic accountant and backtrack to see, okay, these are the bills he has to pay and everything like that. So, had we had a little bit more conversations about that, it would have been easier.
And it certainly takes a lot of stress off family members when those conversations are had, and then plans are had in advance, because all too often we hear of stories of people making these decisions while in the back of an ambulance heading into the hospital. And you actually bring up a great point, which I've always talk to my clients about, and as many people as I can, especially with regard to advanced life-saving measures, because that is, and I've talked to countless doctors who, just feel strongly that,
you should make the decisions yourself. Don't leave it on other people to say, well, would dad have wanted the life support or not? You know, I mean, that's just like the wrong time. And it's difficult because, you know, family members, everybody wants to do the right thing. The problem is people have a different opinion of what the right thing is.
Right thing is. Mm-hmm. And I think,
and so, yeah,
the comfort comes in when you can act on a plan that you know is coming directly from the person that you're caring for.
Yes, and it really turns it around, whether that you're not making the decision for them, you are honoring their wishes, which gives a great peace of mind.
Well, that's one thing I always like to share with folks as it relates to our caregiving story. When my partner Richard made his life transition, you know, as hard as that day was, and I knew one of the comforts that I took was that I knew that everything that he had wanted was
Mm-hmm.
granted to him, because I knew what he wanted. We were fortunate enough to have these open and honest conversations. I knew that when it was ready for hospice, he would tell me, and he did. And all the plans that we had talked about and documented and put in place, they happened. And that there was some stress that was alleviated from me just because I knew I was able to follow his wishes.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And that happened with us as well. That, you know, there was at one point where my father was suffering an issue that the doctor sort of said, well, we could do surgery. And this is at the very end stages of his life. You know, we could do surgery. He probably won't survive it. Or we could see if this thing resolves itself, but he probably won't survive it. And, you know, my mother was like, oh my God, what do we do? We should do, you know, because my mother was very much of the, we have to do everything possible. And I said, well, you know, Mom, Dad filled out this paperwork, and he said, in this situation, don't do anything. And she had a peace with that of like, okay, that's his decision. I'll honor the decision. It turned out, it cleared up after it's, you know, it turned out to resolve itself. And then we were sort of like, well, God, what if we made the decision to do surgery and it went wrong? You know, I mean, it was sort of like, then we're like, thank goodness it was in his hands, because then we didn't have to, you know, second guess anything. And it was really because you want to do something, and what we could do is honor his wishes.
Right. We all want to be proactive, and we all want to do the best we can. And that usually comes when we have as much information as we can have in front of us. And that's why it's so important to have these important conversations as early on as possible, because not only do they impact us while we're in the middle of caregiving, they also impact us after caregiving ends.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. That's very true.
So let's talk a little bit about your book, and you know, I certainly understand what compelled you to write the book, but as you were going through it, looking back at your experience and kind of shifting the focus of your career, what did you learn about the process that you may not have realized before that you'd written the book?
Well, you know, I think I mentioned before that, like, yes, I went to law school, and yes, I understood about, you know, some estate planning, but it's really to kind of get an education, because once you start looking into it, it makes a lot of sense. It can be kind of daunting, but once you start saying, well, okay, you know, what would I, you know, if I couldn't make a medical decision for myself, well, who would I want to make that decision? So, I kind of want people to understand that the first thing they could do is get their own house in order. So go through the estate planning process themselves before they talk with their parents or talk with their loved ones, because then they understand the questions to ask. They understand the issues that need to be considered. You know, so I sort of say, you know, get your own house in order before you start messing with your parents. You know, like,
right.
You know, and it helps because you can, you know, lead in conversations of, you know, I'm considering long-term healthcare insurance. Is that something you guys have looked into? And what's your experience? You know, and it also kind of helps them continue to be the parent, meaning they can give advice and, you know, but you sort of segue in. And, you know, with the the different talks I list, I also have sort of conversation starters. And then once you get this conversation started, kind of a checklist of, the information you really should find out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of, part of it is a little bit of a workbook. The first part is, educating you on the things you should be doing for an estate plan. And then, the second part is, okay, go out and talk to your family or your loved ones and help them with theirs.
Now, I know your book focuses on the sandwich generation, and I would just, I'm sure most of our listeners will know who the sandwich generation is, but that would be caregivers who are taking care of their parents and are raising children at the same time.
Yes.
And
yes, and anybody task. Who is in that, yeah, and it's funny because anybody who is in that, they understand it 100%. It's funny when I talk to, I've even talked to some other estate planning attorneys, much older, who they don't get it. They've never heard this, and I'm like, "Are you kidding me?"
Yeah. We need to send them our podcast today. So. Yeah.
So, and that's something, I actually talk to estate planning attorneys about, look, this is a particular type of client because not only are they worried about their kids, they're worried about their aging parents. And interestingly enough, I read a study that women in the sandwich generation worry more about their parents than their children, which I thought was kind of
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. That's because of the care gene that most women have. I get that. I get that from my 4 older sisters. So I hope we're listening today and giving them some more credit. So,
yeah.
But I don't have children myself. I can only imagine what a daunting task it would have to be balancing those two components, taking care of your parents and raising kids. But it's so important. Another reason why it's so important to have these documents in order.
Yes. And, I know a particular struggle, if you are in that situation, there's always guilt. I mean, caregivers have a ridiculous amount of guilt that they're never doing enough, which isn't true. But there's that feeling, and especially if you have young kids, if you're spending time taking care of your parents, you feel like, well, I'm neglecting the kids. And then if you're spending time with the kids, you're neglecting the parents. So it is particularly challenging. And to your point, by knowing how things should go, knowing your parents' wishes, it does make it easier. So when the time comes, you know what to do rather than trying to struggle with these decisions yourself.
I'd be interested in your opinion on this as a being practical. As I know a lot of caregivers, when they're dealing with the medical profession, they're so afraid of all the big medical terms because they're so conscious of just taking care of the person that they're entrusted to. And I would imagine for some people, there's some of the medical terms can be a little bit frightening, but when you have somebody like yourself who can explain them in layman's terms and has been down that path themselves, it makes it just a tad easier.
Yeah, I mean, sort of because I lived, I sort of lived it before I went into estate planning. I think that has sort of helped me counsel people because, I've been there. I understand when you're out of town, you're calling the hospital trying to get information and they want to know, well, are you on file as the healthcare power of attorney? Or, because hospitals, doctors, they don't want to get sued. With HIPAA, there's just a lot of protections there, but it can be difficult.
And as you know, living in Florida, there's a lot of snowbirds, and I would imagine there's a lot of folks that transplant to California as well. It's so important to have your documents updated in a timely fashion because terms are different from one state to another.
Yes, I mean, if you're planning to, change residencies, it's a good idea to sort of see, what changes you may or may not need to make. You may be fine, but it's a good idea to have that exercise as well as, we sort of say every 2 to 3 years, look at your estate plan and see, are the beneficiaries who I want? Are the people who I named guardian of my children who I want? Your children may have turned 18 at that point. So then you might have different decisions. You might, at that point, depending on where you move, for example, if you move to California, you should always get a trust if you're going to buy a home in California. So, I mean, there's a lot of different things to kind of change and look at.
Yeah, because it's just not one blanket statement across the board.
Yes.
Goodness, there's just I'm learning a lot just by having this very, very friendly conversation with you today, Catherine. So,
well, I enjoy. I mean, you know, for some people, estate planning is boring. I just can't imagine that. I love talking about it. I love demystifying it, because once you walk through of like, okay, this makes sense, or this is going to help me cut down on hassles and cut down on, you know, before and after caregiving. I'm just happy to do it.
And that's, you know, that's really what we try to do here at the Whole Care Network, is just have open and friendly conversations with people. That it's kind of like, you know, you and I are sitting across from each other at our kitchen table, just having an open conversation about something that we're passionate about. Because when we can share our stories like this, I certainly hope that people are touched and can act when they know that there's an area, especially as it comes to estate planning, that they just might be lagging behind in just a bit.
Yeah, and it is, people get busy. There's so many other things, you know, pressing things, but it's only until, you know, an emergency happens that you're like, oh, wow, you know, I really need to get something done. So my hope is that maybe people hearing this prompts them to start thinking about it before there's an emergency.
So if there was, all the documents are important, but if there was one that somebody was listening to right now that they did not have in place, what do you think that would be? I think I have my choice, but I want to hear what.
Yeah. Okay. So that, I mean, it's very difficult as a lawyer to sort of pick one. It's like your children, like which, but, you know, from a personal, and this is coming from a personal standpoint. So my blanket statement, they are all important. Getting your, you know, financial power of attorney, medical power of attorney, advanced medical directives, will, possibly a trust, you know, they're all important. However, from a personal standpoint, I really do think the advanced medical directives, the living will, where you decide how you want to be treated when you are at an end stage condition, because that causes so much heartache for the people left behind who have to make that decision. And, you know, as I talked about in our situation with our family, it gave us so much peace not to make that decision, but to honor his wishes. So, it's something that, you know, when I talk to parents, saying, don't put that on your kids. You know, don't put it on your kids. Because that's what you're doing. Yeah, that's what you're doing. So that would be, you know, so now I'm curious, what do you think is your? Well,
we agree 100%, because I always think back to the Terry Schiavo case here in Florida, and and how unfortunately she didn't have her advanced directives in place, and the anguish that caused everybody. It's just when you can have those advanced directives in place, it does take a lot of stress off the families, and especially I've got some great nieces and nephews who are off to college, and I just mentioned to my nieces, their parents, have you thought about doing advanced directives on your child as they go off to college, because it's never too early to have something like that in place. So
yeah, that's actually a good point. I mean, something people don't like to think about, but as well, you know, one article I wrote for the caregiver space is about, or actually it was for Scary Mommy, about how you should have a medical power of attorney for your 18-year-old, because when they go off to college or you know, do the gap year, if they're hospitalized, you know, you're not near them.
That's right.
And you want to be able to get the information you need. And again, with the HIPAA privacy, it's just less hurdles you have to go through.
It makes it makes a difficult situation just a little bit better when you can plan it in advance. And I know nobody really plans for an accident, or nobody plans to be a caregiver, but there are some tools available that can make the situation just a little bit easier. And I think what you're bringing to the table here today is just a kind of a gentle reminder to go ahead and have these conversations and anticipate that when you have these in place, it's going to make a difficult situation just a little bit easier.
Yeah, and I've sort of structured my book where you can kind of take it chapter by chapter. So you can sort of do one step at a time. So it's not this, oh my God, I have to learn everything at once. But it's, or if, there's a chapter on what to do if there's a death in the family. So there's sort of a checklist of things you should be mindful going through that. So it's sort of to help through the different stages of caregiving.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading your book, and I'd like to do a couple of more of these with you because it's very informative. But we just have a couple of minutes left today. But I'd love to do a whole series on this with you because it's important. It's important for people to really hear it, especially from somebody who's been in the caregiving trenches like yourself.
Yes, well, I'd love to be a part of that.
Terrific. So let our listeners know how they can find your book, contact you online, all the important contact information.
Yeah. So my book is Estate Planning for the Sandwich Generation: How to Help Your Parents and Protect Your Kids. It's on Amazon and can be bought at barnesandnoble.com. I have a website which I have blog posts and different articles about estate planning and caregiving. It's www.hodderinc.com. That's HODDERINK.com. And also on there, I have a section called, which we didn't talk about, but a family binder, which is one place to put your medical, financial, legal information so that, in my situation, when my father was hospitalized, it's one place I could have found his healthcare power of attorney, information about his banking, so I could step in and take care of things. So there's forms on my website if you wanted to put together your own family binder.
I think we have a topic for our next podcast.
I love it.
Family binders. I'm looking at them on the website right now, and goodness, these are terrific, and I had it in my mind to ask you about them, but now we've got a topic for a second podcast. I think that's terrific.
Okay. Wonderful.
I can't thank you enough for joining me today, and through the work that you're doing in Caregivers, you're certainly someone who's creating healing ties all around us. I can't thank you enough for joining me today.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Absolutely.
What a terrific conversation today with Catherine. And if I could just offer just one word of wisdom for our listeners out there. Have that conversation with your loved one about your advance directives. Get your paperwork in order. Because I can tell you from firsthand experience, when you have those important documents in order and readily available, it helps make an already difficult situation just a tad bit easier when you know you are following the wishes of the person that's entrusted in your care. Well, thanks for listening today. As you know, I'm your host, Chris McClellan, the Bowtie Guy. I'm creating a life to love after caregiving ends through radio, writing, travel, advocacy, and being with awesome people like Catherine Hodder. Healing Ties is a part of the Whole Care Network. Check us out online at thewholecarenetwork.com, where you can listen to all our shows, meet our show host, and participate in the Whole Care Network. We'll see you soon for another episode of Healing Ties. Bye-bye.